Political structures created in the southern states were too restricted and fragile to sustain themselves. Republicans employed racial means to protect conservative goals. Southern whites saw danger in African American participation in the government. Federal troops then needed to protect the government and supporters from violent opposition. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 1868 laid out requirements for readmission of southern states and helped with procedures for forming and electing new governments. Congressional actions were put into place to monitor Southern elections and protect black voting rights. This became a routine. Southern Republicans proved a treaty unstable of conflicting elements. In 1877, Democrats regained political control of former Confederate states. Three major Republican groups were formed in the post-war South. In the first group, there were a large majority of African American voters. They outnumbered whites in 3 states. These states are South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. They also made up 25% of the population in Texas, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and made up 40 to 50% in Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. Republicans have to attract white supporters to win elections and sustain power. Northerners, or carpetbaggers, as the native white Southerners called them, were the second group. These Northerners desired personal gain and had commitment to reform the unprogressive South. This was done by the development of material resources and introduction of Yankee institutions such as free labor and free public schools. Many veterans of the Union Army stayed in the South after the war. Although carpetbaggers made up a tiny percent of the population, they played a large role in Southern politics. They won a large share of Reconstruction offices, especially in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. These areas all had a large amount of African American supporters. The final group were the native whites, also called scallywags. They had diverse backgrounds and motives. Some of them were pre-war Whigs trying to regain political influence and saw the party as an agent of modernization and economic expansion. The greatest influence was the up-country strongholds of the Southern Unionism. Loyalists during the war were enemies of the planter elite. The white Southerners then looked up to the Republican Party to help settle old scores and relieve their debt and wartime devastation. Deep contradictions strained the alliance of the 3 groups. Southern Republicans considered themselves the party of progress and civilization and promised a new era of material progress for the region. Republican states' conversions in the 1867 and 1868 stated support for international improvements, school debt relief, and railroads. Few white Southerners identified with political and economic aspirations of African Americans.
Old Confederate leaders were banned from political participation. Carpetbaggers and newly enfranchised African Americans represented many of the plantation districts. Republicans dominated 10 of the Southern Constitutional Conventions of 1867 to 1869. The conventions produced constitutions that expanded democracy by guaranteeing political and civil rights of African Americans, abolishing property qualifications for office holding and jury service, creating the first state-funded systems of education in the South, and mandating the establishment of orphanages, prisons, and mental asylums. In 1868, 3 years after the end of the war, Republicans came to power in most of the southern states. In 1869, new constitutions were ratified in all of the old Confederate states. However, people were skeptical as to how long the new constitutions would last. Republican governments in the South faced the continual crisis of legitimacy that limited their ability to legislate change. They had to balance reform against the need to gain acceptance. Therefore, their achievements were mixed. However, in the realm of race, equal rights and anti-discrimination were achieved. Republican legislators followed up the Civil Rights Act of 1886 with anti-discrimination clauses that provided harsh penalties for civil rights violations. Segregation became the norm in public school systems. African American leaders accepted this to avoid jeopardizing new school system fundings. Many believed that separated schools were better than no schools at all. In fact, many African Americans also believed that all black schools offered a better chance of ensuring education. Demands by African Americans to prohibit segregation in public spaces such as railroad cars, steamboats, and theaters heightened divisions within the Republican Party. Moderate white Republicans feared that such laws would further alienate white supporters. By the early 1870s, laws guaranteeing equal access to public areas passed in many states as black influence and assertiveness grew. However, civil rights laws were difficult to enforce in the local communities. Economically, the Republican governments failed to fulfill African Americans' hopes of obtaining land. Few former slaves had the money to buy land in the open market, and therefore they looked to the state for help. Republicans tried to weaken the plantation systems and promote black ownership by raising the taxes on land. However, even when the state government seized land for non-payment of taxes, the property was never used to help create black homesteads. Virtually all of it found its way back to its original owners after the owner paid minimal penalties. Republican leaders emphasized the gospel of prosperity as the key to improving economic fortunes of all Southerners by promoting Northern-style capitalist development through state aid, such as factories, large towns, and diversified agriculture. Much of Republican state lawmaking was dedicated toward railroad construction. From 1868 to 1873, state legislatures passed hundreds of bills promoting railroads. Government backing also gave railroad companies credibility and helped them raise capital. In exchange, the states received liens on railroads. From 1868 to 1872, Southern railroad systems were rebuilt with over 3,000 miles of track added, almost a 40% increase. While it was difficult to attract the attention of Northern and European investment capitals, it did open the doors to widespread corruption and bribery of public officials. It also led to the overextension of credit and many bankruptcies, while saddling Republican governments with enormous debts. Railroad failures eroded public confidence in the Republicans' ability to govern, and ultimately the gospel of prosperity failed to modernize the economy or solidify the Republican Party in the South.